Thank you, Andy, and thank you everyone for coming. Tonight we will experience wild stories from the history of bird migration research. Rebecca Heisman is an award-winning science writer who lives in Walla Walla, Washington, and has worked with organizations including the Audubon Society, the American Bird Conservancy, Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and the American Ornithological Society. Flight Paths is her first book. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Give me just a moment to start sharing my screen. All right. There we go. It took me a while to figure out how to do this so that I can see presenter view with my notes and the other people on Zoom only see the slides. So hopefully I've got it set up right. All right, so yeah, thank you again for having me. I'm so excited to talk to you guys this evening. As Becky said, I'm here tonight because I am the author of a book that came out, gosh, over a year and a half ago now, although that doesn't seem possible, on the history of how we've figured out bird migration research, or the history of how we figured out bird migration through research, excuse me. I spent several years of my life immersed in this topic. I read more scientific papers than I could possibly count. I talked to dozens of scientists, including a lot of electrical engineers and computer scientists, as well as ornithologists. I joined a few ornithologists in the field to kind of shadow them while they were carrying out their research. And it was just a ball. I feel really privileged to get to tell the stories of the scientists who are profiled in this book. I still feel like they're the real experts, and I'm just trying to bring the amazing things that they're doing to a wider audience. And that is a really fun job to have because really there are so many good stories to tell about bird migration. So here we have just a few of the amazing migrators whose stories appear in my book. On the lower left, this is a bar-tailed godwit. These birds, you may have heard of this, in the fall, they make a nonstop flight from Alaska across the Pacific Ocean to New Zealand without touching down. I believe it's still the longest recorded nonstop migratory flight of any bird in the world, which is astonishing. In the middle, this bird is a bar-headed goose. They make what is almost certainly the world's highest altitude migration. They fly over the Himalayan mountains as they travel back and forth in Asia every year. And then in the upper right, this little guy is a blackpoll warbler, which I'm guessing a lot of you are familiar with. To get from New England down to their wintering grounds in South America, they launch themselves out and spend 3 days flying over the open water of the Western Atlantic, which maybe sounds less impressive than the godwit crossing the Pacific, but you have to remember that a godwit is about the size of a football and a blackpoll warbler weighs about the same as a ballpoint pen. So just amazing things that these birds are doing. But for me, what fascinates me just as much as what migrating birds do and how they do it is how we figured all of this out. So that's what my book is really about, and that's what I'm here to talk about this evening. Before I really dive into that, I want to give just a little bit more background on how I came to write this book. So before COVID, I worked full time for an organization called the American Ornithological Society. This is the big professional organization for bird scientists in North America. They give out research grants, they put on an annual conference, and they also publish two peer-reviewed scientific journals, which are what you see here. So this is where scientists, publish their reports on their new findings. I was their full-time communications person. I was a communications department of one, so I wore a lot of hats. But a big part of my job was publicizing the new research that was being published in these journals. So as part of that, I read a lot of scientific papers. And I don't know how many of you watching this evening are familiar with the structure of a scientific paper, but they all follow the same basic format. They start with the introduction, where the researchers explain what sort of research question they were trying to answer and why it's important. And then there's the methods where they go through step by step the procedure that they followed to collect their data. And then there's the results and discussion where they talk about what they found and why it matters and kind of where things might go from here. And I was reading all of these papers and I kept getting sucked into and fascinated by the part that I suspect a lot of people sort of skim over to get to the good stuff, which is the methods. I didn't know, or if I had learned it as a college student, I had forgotten that you can study bird migration using weather radar. You can study bird migration by putting up microphones to record the nocturnal flight calls of birds passing overhead at night. You can study bird migration by analyzing rare hydrogen isotopes in bird feathers. I'm not even going to get into that this evening, but there's a whole chapter about it in my book, and it's just wild. So at some point, I started wondering, like, what's the science behind all of these different techniques? How do they work? And who even figured out that some of these things might be possible? And I ended up leaving that job around the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and I decided to write a book proposal, which turned into the book that came out last year. So I cover a lot of ground in the book. This is the table of contents. Basically, the format of it is I just went chapter by chapter in chronological order, roughly chronological order, through each of the major techniques that have been developed to figure out where birds go on their migration. So beginning with the early years of scientific bird banding in the very beginning of the 20th century and going all the way up through, recent high-tech advances like machine learning and things like that. But when I thought about how I was going to adapt all this into a, fun 45-minute book talk, there's no way I was going to cram all this into a talk. I can't talk that fast. So I decided that the most fun way to do it would be to just pick three of my favorite stories from the book to zoom in on and share. And so that's what I'm going to do this evening. I'm going to tell the stories of three of my favorite migration innovators who I learned about in the course of doing this research. And then I'm going to wrap up by talking a little bit about why this is relevant today for bird conservation. And my hope is that you will come away with a new appreciation of all of the hard work and creativity that went into uncovering every gee whiz fact that you hear about bird migration. All right, so the first tactic for figuring out what migratory birds are doing that I want to talk about is one that I had not even heard of before I started doing the research for this book, and this is called moon watching. So most songbirds migrate at night. There's a number of reasons for that, but it means that if you want to observe what they're doing during migration, you can't just look up and see them because it's dark outside. So you need to get creative. And today we have all sorts of high-tech tools like radar, which we're going to talk about, and satellite telemetry to help us spy on these night migrating birds. But before any of that technology was developed, this guy, whose name was George Lowry, came up with a really clever way to do this using just a telescope. George Lowry was born in Louisiana in 1913. He was an obsessive birder from a very young age. He finished his master's degree in ornithology from Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge in 1936. And he stayed on there for the rest of his career as an instructor and an ornithologist, and he helped found LSU's Museum of Zoology, which is still going strong today. Now, being an avid birder and living along the Gulf Coast, George Lowry would have been very familiar with the phenomenon of migratory fallout. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this too, but just to review, this is when birds that are migrating north in the spring, they cross the Gulf of Mexico. And then depending on the weather conditions, sometimes they basically just fall out of the sky en masse at the first bit of land that they get to. So like the first grove of trees behind the beach might just be absolutely dripping with every conceivable kind of migratory songbird when conditions are right. And although there wasn't really any way to prove it at the time, a lot of ornithologists in the early 20th century, George Lowry included, thought, based on circumstantial evidence like this, that it was likely that migrating birds crossed over the open water of the Gulf of Mexico on a regular basis, that this was a normal part of the annual cycle for these birds. And then in the 1940s, a second biologist named George Williams. George was a popular name for mid-century biologists. We're going to talk about three different Georges tonight. But George number two, George Williams, comes along and says, hang on, this makes no sense. Why would all of these birds voluntarily be flying over hundreds of miles of open water when Mexico is right there? Basically, George Williams, George number two, was like, guys, I know we don't see a lot of these birds in Mexico, but we just must not be looking hard enough because it's the only thing that makes sense. Now, George number one, George Lowry, was really annoyed by this because again, he had seen these birds arriving and like practically falling out of the trees after they crossed the Gulf with his own eyes. He was very confident that large-scale trans-Gulf migration was a real phenomenon. And so he was pissed off by this and immediately set about finding a way that he could prove George Williams wrong. And Lowry remembered some quirky ornithology papers from the very early years of the 20th century, where folks had reported looking at the full moon through a telescope during bird migration and being able to see the silhouettes of these night migrating birds in front of the moon. Sometimes even see them well enough that they were able to identify what general kind of bird they were looking at. And Lowry thought, that's interesting. That seems like it might have some potential. Luckily for Lowry, there was also an astronomer working at LSU at the time who was an avid birder. And so Lowry and this astronomer put their heads together and they came up with a set of equations that would let Lowry take a raw count of how many birds he saw passing in front of the moon in a certain amount of time and do some math and turn this into an estimate of the total number of birds crossing an imaginary 1 mile line on the Earth's surface every hour. Lowry called this the migration traffic rate. Now, this sounds pretty abstract. It is pretty abstract. But what this meant was that Lowry now had a way to compare how much migration was happening at one time and place with how much migration was happening at another time and place. And it sounds simple, but there had really never been a good way to quantify this before. So Lowry's like, all right, here I go. I'm going to do it. I'm going to prove George Williams wrong. April 1945, he packs up a telescope. He gets on a boat headed across the Gulf of Mexico for a port on the Yucatan Peninsula. The first night, he's so excited. This is his big moment. He goes up on deck, unpacks his telescope and sets it up. He points it out at the moon. He looks in the eyepiece. George Lowry did not have any experience at sea, and so he had failed to anticipate the fact that when he viewed the moon through the telescope on a ship out on the open water of the Gulf, the moon, as viewed through the telescope, would be bobbing up and down in a way that made it impossible to get a really accurate count of the birds that were flying. But George Lowry was not a man who gave up easily. He knew there must be thousands of birds streaming overhead. And so he waited until the boat docked in the Yucatan where the water was calmer and he tried again. And pointing his telescope out at the full moon rising over the Gulf, he tallied 12 birds in about 45 minutes, which may not sound like a lot, but when he did the math, it worked out to more than 3,700 birds passing over a 1 mile line extending out into the Gulf every hour. So George Lowry had just collected the first hard numerical evidence that trans-Gulf migration was real. Take that, George number 2. So Lowry was just getting started. He knew he was onto something big here. His next idea was that he could scale this up and recruit volunteers from across North America to collect this kind of data. He knew that he had hit on a method that had the potential to reveal migration patterns at the scale of the whole continent for the first time. But this was going to be in the pre-internet era. Coordinating something like this was going to be a huge undertaking. He couldn't do it alone. And so luckily for George Lowry, an enthusiastic young grad student named Bob Newman arrived at LSU right about this time. So this is George Lowry on the left, Bob Newman on the right. This is obviously not Bob Newman as a young grad student, but in the pre-smartphone camera era, people didn't really get a lot of photos taken of themselves and published until they were famous later in their careers. So use your imagination. Like Lowry, Bob Newman arrived at LSU as a grad student and ended up staying on for the rest of his career. And these two men formed a working partnership that lasted until Lowry's death in the 1970s. They actually both passed away decades ago, so I did not get to talk to either of them when I was researching this book, but I did get to talk to an ornithologist now in his 80s who worked with both of them when he was a grad student and who shared his reminiscences with me. And it sounds like in a lot of ways, these two men could not have been more different. They were sort of the odd couple of ornithology. George Lowry was an old school gentleman naturalist who wore a suit and tie for field work and organized expeditions into the jungle to gather new specimens for his museum. And he was a workaholic who would go home to eat dinner with his wife and then sneak back into the office afterward to get a little more work done. Bob Newman, on the right, was a jokester. He had a reputation for his sense of humor, and he also approached problems much more like a modern scientist. Bob Newman taught himself statistics before that was a common skill for zoologists, And he made it a personal mission to keep up with the latest bird migration research being published all over the world. And so together, these two men came up with a plan to collect a snapshot of migration activity across the entire continent during a single week in October. You can do moon watching for a couple of days on either side of the full moon and get good data. Now, no one had ever tried doing something like this at this scale before. Again, this was before the internet. It was basically before computers. And so the way they pulled this off is these two guys spent as much as 12 hours a day handwriting personal letters to hundreds of potential volunteers all over the continent, targeting a lot of local bird clubs and local Audubon chapters, just explaining the goals of the project and what volunteer data collectors would have to do and the special contribution that they would be making to science. And eventually they managed to recruit more than 2,500 volunteers in 325 locations from Canada down to Panama. They really wanted to make sure that this worked well, that they got good quality data back. So they even took the step of printing up a how-to pamphlet to mail off to all of their volunteers, complete with some tips on how to stay comfortable during long stints of staring up at the sky. So this is an actual figure from one of their how-to pamphlets. And I can't decide if this was meant to be funny, knowing again that Bob Newman had a good sense of humor, or if it was just the 50s. I don't know, but the cigar is a nice touch. Finally, in fall 1952, telescopes swung into action across North America. And soon observations were flooding in, paper data sheets mailed in from every part of the continent were stacking up higher and higher on Lowry and Newman's desks. And they realized that they had a problem that they maybe should have given more thought to ahead of time, which was exactly how they were going to analyze all of this data. Again, no access to computers. This was before most zoologists even had any training in statistics. Now they needed to calculate the average direction and volume of bird migration from hundreds of locations. They needed to look up data on temperature and wind and the movement of cold fronts for each of those locations. They needed to check for patterns in how migration related to weather across the continent. And they needed to depict all of this on maps, which they would have to draw by hand. It took them 14 years. Finally, in 1966, their magnum opus was published in the ornithological journal, The Auk, which was coincidentally one of the same journals that I would be working for about 5 decades later. They titled it A Continent-Wide View of Bird Migration on 4 Nights in October. And it was filled with page after page of these painstakingly crafted maps where they used these different colored arrows to indicate the volume and direction of bird migration at locations across the country on the nights of October 1st through 4th, 1952. And I feel like today, when we're so used to seeing, satellite images of the Earth and stuff, it's easy to just go, okay, yeah, cool, whatever. But at the time, to see migration patterns laid out at the scale of the whole continent like this would have been totally new and just totally amazing to people who were interested in this. In the Midwest and East, you could see these massive migratory flights that spanned multiple states. You could see how favorable winds and the movement of cold fronts affected these migration patterns, with the heaviest migration occurring in front of advancing cold fronts. This paper was a blockbuster. It was 40 pages long. It influenced studies of migration for generations to come, or decades to come, I should say. And it was also the last moon watching paper that Lowry and Newman would ever publish together, because all of this hard work was about to be made almost entirely obsolete by the rise of a new technology, and that was radar. Excuse me. So this is an image from the National Weather Radar System, the same one that you see images from on the Weather Channel, to show with the green and orange blobs to show you where rainstorms are. And you can see some rain on this map. It's especially like those green streaks over on the East Coast. But all of those big round blobs down the middle of the continent are birds. Now, they generally filter migrating birds and any other distractions out of the radar images that they use for TV weather reports. But birds actually show up really well on radar. And so during migration, when there are these big waves of birds moving across the continent, they show up as these sort of donut-shaped or round blobs, because each of those round blobs is actually just the field of view of one individual radar station. And so in the evening when they're lifting off for their night of flying, there's so many of them that they just saturate the field of view of the radar stations. But when people first started using radar in a big way, it hadn't really occurred to anyone yet that they might pick up birds. They weren't looking for birds. They weren't looking for rainstorms either. They were looking for Nazi planes. So to get a tiny bit technical, just for a moment here, radar stands for radio detection and ranging. And the way that this works is there's just a special radio transmitter beaming out radio waves. And as those waves bounce off of objects in their path, some of their energy is reflected back to the radar equipment. And how much energy comes back and the angle that it comes in at tells you something about the size and distance of any objects that the radio waves are running up against. So it's basically like sonar or echolocation, but with radio waves instead of sound. British scientists had worked all of this out by the 1930s. And so by the time World War II really got going, they had built radar stations up and down the British coast to detect incoming planes from the European mainland. But pretty much as soon as these new radar stations were operational, they started picking up some weird signals. So planes, as viewed on radar at the time, would have appeared as blips that plodded along at consistent speeds and trajectories, but they were seeing these weird little things that changed direction and appeared and disappeared at random. Supposedly, at one point, a red alert was sounded and British fighter planes were ordered into the air to intercept strange signals over the English Channel, only to get up into the sky and find nothing there. The exasperated radar operators started calling these mystery signals radar angels. Now, while all of that was going on, this guy had been teaching science at a secondary school in Devonshire in southwestern England. His name was David Lack, and he didn't know it yet, but he was about to become the father of radar ornithology. And again, David Lack was a young guy at the time that we're going to be talking about, but I couldn't find a photo of young David Lack, so you'll have to use your imagination a bit. David Lack had always been interested in birds. He had studied ornithology at Cambridge before becoming a teacher. And in 1938, he took a year off from his teaching job to travel to the Galapagos Islands to study Darwin's famous finches there. He arrived back in the UK just as war was breaking out. And David Lack later wrote a short memoir about the early years of his career. So I'm going to read to you a little bit in David Lack's own words about what happened next as he arrived back in England at the beginning of World War II. I had become a pacifist at the age of 17, so he'd signed a pledge to an anti-war organization. And in the autumn of 1940, I decided that I ought to leave my job at the school to work with a pacifist unit. I spent a trial night in the East End of London during heavy raids, but was so put off by the pacifists' earnest attitudes, and so excited by the flashes and bangs, that I was immediately converted from pacifism. A month later, the Central Register for Scientific Workers sent me to interview for an unspecified job. So he's joining the war effort, but since he has a science background, they want to give him a science job. As a biologist, you will, of course, have learned a lot of physics, the interviewer said. I'm afraid not, I answered. Well, I expect your maths is of a high standard. I'm afraid not. Then, very doubtfully, I fear this job will often entail going out in the wet and cold in the dark. Would you mind that? Not at all. So I was taken on and 10 days later set off from London with 19 other biologists on a mystery coach tour. So you can see where this is going. Lack was assigned to a job working on radar systems. He was first posted to the Orkneys, which are a wet, windy, remote group of islands off the north end of Scotland, where I gather he was just about the only person happy to be sent there because the birding was really good. But shortly after that, on a tour of radar installations up and down the British coast, he was reintroduced to an old acquaintance of his named George Varley. I promised you a third George. Here he is. George Varley had been a classmate of Lack's at Cambridge, and Varley had actually been an entomologist, so a bug guy, before the war. But now he had fallen into the same line of work as Lack. And it was Varley who introduced Lack to the mystery of the angels plaguing the radar operators. Now, David Lack was an ornithologist by training. He was familiar with the behavior of birds in flight. And he pretty much immediately was like, guys, it's birds. Nobody believed him. So Lack and Varley decided that they were going to make a project out of this and put their heads together on how to prove that this was what was going on. They got pretty creative about it. At one point, they convinced an officer to tie a dead gull to a balloon and send it up into the air in front of a radar station just to demonstrate that it was at least possible for a bird carcass to produce a radar signal. Finally, in September 1941, Varley managed to use a powerful telescope to confirm that the source of his signal being tracked offshore in real time was in fact a flock of gannets, the seabird that you see here. As the war continued, Lack and Varley continued to collect radar observations that they believed represented birds. The technology was advancing really fast, so pretty soon they weren't only picking up big birds like geese and gannets, they were also picking up things like flocks of starlings. And so they continued collecting data that showed that the behavior of the so-called angels, like their airspeed and tendency to fly with or against the wind, were consistent with the behavior of birds in flight. Not everyone was easily convinced, and so I'm going to read one more brief David Lack quote just because I really like his sense of humor. At one meeting, he wrote, after the physicists had again gravely explained that clouds of ions must be responsible, Varley with equal gravity accepted their view, providing that the ions were wrapped in feathers. So they stuck with it, and finally, as the end of the war neared in 1945, they got permission to publish their previously top-secret findings in the journal Nature. Today, David Lack, who died in 1973, is better remembered for a book that he wrote about Darwin's finches. But this publication essentially kicked off the whole subdiscipline now known as radar ornithology. Radar ornithology, of course, might have been a footnote in my book instead of a whole chapter, if not for the fact that after the war, meteorologists started developing radar technology in a big way as a way to provide early warnings about hurricanes and other major storms. Large flocks of birds showed up just as well on weather radar as they had on military radar. So this was great news for ornithologists interested in looking at large-scale migration patterns. And as weather radar technology has continued to advance over time, the data that we get from it has just been better and better. And this is still an important source of data for this type of migration research today. Sorry, my throat's getting a little dried out. Thanks for bearing with me. So I'm going to just briefly talk about an example study that I think gives you a sense of what you can do with modern radar data. In 2018, two scientists from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology published a study for which they had downloaded radar scans covering every evening for the past 23 years, more than 150,000 individual radar images of the country. And they analyzed these radar scans to see how weather factors like temperature and wind and air pressure predicted the appearance of big migration movements on radar. Because, migration is a season that goes on for weeks, but it's not like there's an equal number of birds in the sky each night. There's big nights and there's quiet nights. And so they wanted to know, like, why are some nights bigger than others? And so they found that by looking at the weather, they could actually explain almost 80% of the variation in migration intensity from one night to the next, and they could even predict these big migratory movements several days in advance. So if you are familiar with Birdcast, which is this very cool tool run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where during migration you can log in and see a forecast of how many millions of birds are going to pass over your location that night. This is the technology that Birdcast is based on. And it is all thanks to a witty science teacher from Devonshire who figured out what was really going on with those mysterious angels annoying the radar operators guarding England from the Nazis. But, of course, radar is not the only way to put radio waves to work tracking birds. And so this brings me to my third favorite and final migration innovator of the evening. All right, so this guy's name is Bill Cochran. Young Bill Cochran on the left, Bill Cochran later in his career on the right. In the mid-1950s, Bill Cochran was a young Navy veteran working on an electrical engineering degree part-time while also working for a brand new television station based in Champaign, Illinois. One morning, he went to check on his employer's transmitter tower on the outskirts of town, and there he found an ornithologist from the University of Illinois picking up dead birds off the ground. Cochran was really intrigued by this, wanted to know what the guy was doing there, and started peppering him with questions. It turned out that the ornithologist's name was Richard Graeber, and he was there because he was studying tower kills, which is this phenomenon where flocks of birds fly into communications towers and are killed by the impact. Cochrane was intrigued and struck up a friendship with Graeber, and pretty soon he was spending his spare time tinkering together gadgets to help Graeber in his work. Remember, Cochrane was a budding engineer. Bill Cochrane appears in more chapters of my book than any other single researcher. The first project that he and Graeber worked on together was figuring out a way to record the nocturnal flight calls of birds flying overhead. So birds that migrate at night, some species make these unique calls that they don't make at any other time. And so Cochrane and Graeber were the first people to actually make recordings of these calls. And one of my favorite little stories from the whole book is Bill Cochrane, the engineering student, figuring out how to rig up a tape recorder with bicycle axles to hold the 6,000 feet of tape that they would need to record an entire 8-hour night. This is Graeber standing next to their recording equipment here. But the chapter in my book where Bill Cochrane looms the largest by far is the one on radio telemetry. All right. So there were two technological advances right around this time that really helped kick off the field of radio telemetry. Telemetry just means transmitting data from one place to another in real time. The first one was the invention of the transistor in 1947. Before this, to take something that's pretty technical and boil it down to the essentials, radios relied on bulky, breakable vacuum tubes to amplify the signals that they sent out. Transistors, this is a replica of the first transistor here, they provided a lightweight, efficient, durable way of doing the same thing, and they made it possible to adapt radios for all sorts of tasks that they would not have been suited for before, including transmitting all kinds of sensitive data from one place to another. So one of the first groups to jump on this and start experimenting with radio telemetry was the US Navy. They started trying things like using radio signals to transmit real-time data on a jet pilot's vital signs to a doctor monitoring them on the ground, and to study the effectiveness of cold water suits for sailors by beaming out temperature data from a monitor inside the suit. It did not take long at all, however, for wildlife researchers to begin borrowing some of these same techniques. In a way, my whole book is just about ornithologists being really good at borrowing advances from other fields. So in 1957, some scientists in Antarctica used the system from the cold water suit tests to remotely monitor the temperature of a penguin egg during incubation. That's what's happening here. That's a penguin being manhandled in the lower right. That same year, a group of researchers in Maryland borrowed some ideas from the jet pilot project and surgically implanted transmitters in woodchucks to follow their movements around a small nature preserve. Soon, big companies like Honeywell were getting involved in this, trying to design radio tracking systems that they could sell to wildlife biologists as a way of monitoring animals' movements. But they were trying things like strapping a metal box containing a radio transmitter onto the back of a grouse and releasing it into the bushes. And a grouse with a metal box strapped to its back is not going to last very long. So before wildlife telemetry could really take off, someone was literally going to have to think outside the box. Haha, sorry, I couldn't resist. And that someone was going to turn out to be Bill Cochrane. Now, I said two technological advances. The first one was the transistor. The second thing that plays into this was the launch of Sputnik in 1957. Sputnik was, of course, the first artificial satellite launched by the Soviets. Basically, all it did was circle the Earth and beep. But if you had a radio receiver and you knew what you were doing, you could pick up this beep from space from anywhere on Earth. And so this touched off a whole new wave of interest in radios and what they could do. And so by 1960, Bill Cochrane, who still had not actually finished that electrical engineering degree, but was apparently really good with transistors, had picked up more part-time work helping a University of Illinois astronomer build radio beacons that were going to go up on some of the first US satellites. Actually, some of the first US spy satellites, although they did not know that that's what they were working on. Cochrane was also still doing some work with Graeber and his colleagues over at the Illinois Natural History Survey. And it did not take too long before someone suggested that it might be fun to try combining Cochrane's two part-time gigs. Like, hey, Bill, what if we put one of your radio gizmos on a duck? I don't know, sounds fun, let's try it. So They sent a duck over from the field station on the Illinois River. They strapped a transmitter onto this bird using a metal band that went over its chest. And although they hadn't really planned this, it turned out that the bird's breathing distorted the band in a way that affected the radio signal, so that when they released the duck, they found that they could track its respiratory rate as it flew, accidentally collecting the first data on the physiology of a bird in flight. They all got a nice little publication out of it. And that moment, when that duck took flight wearing a radio transmitter that he had built, something clicked for Bill Cochran. And he knew that this was how he was going to spend the rest of his career, was building radio transmitters for studying wildlife. Building a radio transmitter to be worn by a wild animal requires making trade-offs among a long list of factors. A longer antenna will give you a stronger signal, and a bigger battery will give you a longer lasting tag, but they both add weight. And Cochran, who wouldn't officially finish that electrical engineering degree for several more years, turned out to be really good at getting this balance just right. He favored designs that were as small and simple and compact as possible, and instead of putting the components in a metal box, he figured out how to dip the whole assembly into plastic resin to seal and waterproof it together. Now, I think we're all familiar with like radio collars for deer and wolves. Really, all of wildlife telemetry goes back to Bill Cochran. He was the first person to make this stuff practical. Early in his career, one of his first projects was working with a wildlife biologist who wanted a better way to study the local cottontail rabbit population. But thanks to his friend and mentor, ornithologist Richard Graeber, Cochran's main interest was always birds. And it didn't take too long before he was building transmitters small enough that they could safely be placed on a good-sized songbird. And this was great news for his friend Richard Graeber, because Richard Graeber studied thrushes, which are a relatively good-sized songbird, and he was interested in knowing more about their migratory behavior. But these devices only had a range of a few miles, and that means that if you wanted to use one to follow a bird on migration, you literally had to follow the bird on migration. So in 1965, Graeber found a pilot who was willing to try following a migrating radio-tagged thrush at night in a small plane. That's the plane they used there. You can see all the antennas sticking out of it. In May 1965, they captured a gray-cheeked thrush outside Urbana, Illinois. They trimmed the feathers from a small patch on its back, and they stuck on a little radio transmitter using eyelash glue, the stuff you would use to attach false eyelashes, which has been popular for this sort of thing over the years because it's non-toxic, it doesn't irritate the skin, and it wears off on its own after a while. They waited until dusk fell and knew the bird was probably taking off for its night of flying, and then they took off in the plane and picked up the signal. That night, Graeber and the pilot followed this individual bird north for 400 miles before turning around, 200 of which were over the open water of Lake Michigan. They couldn't see the bird, of course. They were just flying through the night, listening to this wavering beep, beep, beep over the receiver. But Richard Graeber, the ornithologist, was so awed by this experience and by imagining what it was that this tiny bird was really doing, that when he later wrote about this for Audubon magazine, he compared it to how he felt watching the TV coverage of the Apollo moon missions. And Bill Cochran was just getting started. I need another drink of water, sorry. All right. 1973, Cochran and a student named Charles Welling tagged another thrush passing through Illinois in the spring, and this time they spent a full week following this bird almost 1,000 miles, all the way across the Canadian border and into Manitoba in a station wagon with a hole cut in the top for their radio receiver. I read the very dry 2-page paper summing up this project and my jaw just dropped. I couldn't believe that someone really did this. They had quite a few adventures that did not make it into the scientific paper. At one point, Welling, the student who was along to help drive, basically spent a night in jail when a suspicious police officer pulled them over in rural Minnesota. Because, I mean, who wouldn't be suspicious of this thing driving through your small Minnesota town in the middle of the night? Cochran really did not want to stop for too long for fear that he would lose the bird's signal. So he basically kicked Welling out of the car to sort things out, kept on going, waited until the bird set down around dawn, where he knew he'd be able to find it again that evening, doubled back, bailed Welling out, and on they went. At another point, they both came down with a mysterious stomach flu and they couldn't find a doctor willing to see them on no notice in the middle of nowhere, so they just sweated it out and kept driving. As they went, they gathered data on the bird's altitude, its airspeed and ground speed, the distance it covered each night, the precise heading that it set out on each night. And because they were able to stick with this one bird over such a long distance, Cochrane and Welling were able to track how the precise direction that the bird set out in each night changed as its position changed relative to magnetic north. Which, oops, I didn't mean to do that. That's a first. Okay. I don't usually do that. All right. But so anyway, this provided some of the first real world evidence that migrating songbirds are using some sort of internal magnetic compass as one of their tools for navigation. The only reason they stopped after they crossed over into Canada was because the car's engine finally gave out. Okay. Bill Cochrane always was a bit of an outsider. He never really got the hang of the politics of academia or of the peer review system for scientific publishing. A lot of the things he did were never really published properly. I also gather that he was just maybe not the easiest guy to get along with personally. He was married 3 times, for one thing. So he always remained a bit of an outsider. And by the late 1990s, he had left the Illinois Natural History Survey on what I gather were maybe not the best terms. But he kept building radio systems for ornithologists in his garage right into the beginning of this century. And I had the great good fortune to speak to Bill multiple times while I was researching my book, and even to visit him at his home in Illinois, where most of the backyard was taken up with an enormous radio receiver tower, and this station wagon was still in the driveway. He was a hilarious character. He liked to screen his phone calls by pretending to be a janitor in an animal shelter when he answered the phone. So I would call him at a prearranged time for a phone interview, and he'd pick up the phone and go, "Animal shelter, we're closed." And I'd just be like, "Bill, is that you? It's Rebecca." So he was just a hoot. Sadly, Bill passed away, gosh, 2 years now, I guess, at the age of 90. I really believe that he is an unsung hero of 20th century science, and I'm really happy that my book is hopefully making more people aware of all of the amazing things that he accomplished. All right, I've been talking a lot. I'm reaching the last couple slides of my talk here, I promise. In my last few minutes, like I said, I want to talk a little bit about migratory connectivity and why this all matters for conservation. I chose historical stories for this talk on purpose, partly because I've given this talk to audiences of ornithologists, and I was concerned that if I talked about some of the contemporary researchers who are in my book, I might end up talking about someone who was in the audience, and that just seemed a little awkward. So I promise that if you get to read the whole book, it is not all dead white guys, to be blunt about it. And I also, in the book, I cover a lot of the more recent developments in this field, like the latest miniaturized tracking devices and artificial intelligence tools for analyzing big data sets and high volume genomic sequencing, all that kind of stuff. And it's really fascinating because thanks to all of these recent high-tech advances, we now have a clearer, more detailed picture of bird migration than ever before. That sort of data can help us target conservation efforts more effectively. And that's a good thing because migrating birds are really not doing so well. So some of you might have heard of this paper when it came out back in 2019 because it got a lot of media coverage at the time. This is what's been called the 3 billion birds paper because this large group of scientists looked at a whole bunch of different data sources and concluded that there are about 2.9 billion with a B fewer breeding birds in North America now than there were in 1970. This is a staggering decline. And so since this paper came out, researchers and wildlife managers have been scrambling to figure out how to stop the bleeding, if you will. And so when it came time to write the concluding chapter for my book and try to tie a bow on this whole thing, I wanted to try to tackle the question of whether these new tracking technologies might be at least part of the solution, and also just whether there's any reason to feel hopeful when we look at numbers like this. So what I did was I called up a couple of the leading experts on migratory bird conservation today to ask them, big picture, what they thought about this. So I talked to Pete Mara, who's one of the senior authors on this paper and a co-founder of what they've called the Road to Recovery initiative that's grown out of it. And I also talked to Jill Deppy, who's the director of the Audubon Society's Migratory Bird Initiative. I asked them questions like, what is the state of migratory bird conservation today? And are you hopeful for the future? And they both had strikingly similar things to say. They agreed that despite all the ever more detailed migration research that's happening now, we still need more data to understand what's really behind the declines of many of these species. So you might think like we should stop pouring so much money into collecting data and just redirect it all to conservation, but the truth is we don't even know enough to do effective conservation for a lot of these birds yet. They also agreed that there is a need to better consolidate the data that is being collected and get it into the hands of policymakers and conservation activists, to get better at working across international borders, to incorporate more partners in the social sciences and more perspectives from Indigenous people. And somewhat to my surprise, they both insisted that yes, there is still reason for hope. So I'm going to close by reading a little bit of what Pete Mara said when I asked him if he feels hopeful about the future. He said, yes, I'm very optimistic. We've done this in the past. We've corrected other environmental issues, and now we have to deal with climate change. So while it seems like there's this overwhelming deluge of negative issues and challenges with getting people on board with these things and constant pressures on nature, I choose to be optimistic and hopeful just because I don't see any benefit of being pessimistic or having a lack of hope. I just don't choose to take that route. Don't get me wrong, there are times when I might be negative or spiraling down into a pit of agony, but I'm not going to do that. I thought those were wise words, and I don't know about all of you, but when I find myself spiraling down into a pit of agony, I usually just go birding. So that is the conclusion of my talk. Thank you so much for having me. A couple real quick plugs, if I may. This is my website, RebeccaHeisman.com. I really hope that some of you decide to read the whole book after hearing this talk, because I've just barely scratched the surface. And if you decide to buy a copy, I'm not there to sign books in person, but I have a few book plate stickers left. So if you go to my website, there's a contact form that goes right to my email. You can just say, hey, I bought a copy of your book after hearing your talk, and I will mail one of these to you, and you can turn it into a signed book. The other thing you can find at my website is I have a monthly email newsletter with stuff that I've been writing and like book recommendations, stuff like that. I get asked all the time if I'm working on a second book. The answer as of now is no, but if that changes, the newsletter would be the place to find out about that. And yeah, with that, I would be happy to take any questions.
Rebecca, I neglected to mention to everyone that they should type their questions into the chat. And so for those who didn't see it on the announcements, if you have questions, please do that. And we'll translate.
Rebecca, there is one question that came up. In the pictures of the radar, when you were back, where there was all these round circles of blue and green and so on.
Yeah.
What do the different colors signify?
Here I can go back to that. Let's see. I mean, when you see rainstorms, of course, the different colors just signify like how much rain there is. Like, green is light rain and red is more rain. So I think, blue is a few birds and green is more birds. I think it's probably just like the density of birds in the air is what I would assume.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
When the recording is posted, all of the information that you just gave will be linked as well, Rebecca.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Susan.
Jump back to
Let's see what else we've got here. Lots of accolades and wow. What a super presentation. No question, but Rebecca's presentation was simply captivated. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.
That's from one of our board people.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Is there anything else, or?
I am not catching questions. Charlie, are you?
No, I'm sorry.
That's fine.
Oh, here's from Mary Harco. I read the book. It is powerful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Mary. I'm glad
Beautiful.
you liked it.
Oh, this is great. I can't wait to read it.
I hope you like
I
it.
agree.
I'm serious that this is barely scratching the surface of all of the wild stories that are in there. The history of bird migration research is surprisingly entertaining.
And your take on the personalities of these gentlemen, terrific.
A lot of fun characters, yeah.
I
Rebecca,
guess.
Rebecca, does your book talk about like the current theory of how it is that birds migrate, like how they know to follow the paths that they do and how they always return to the same places every year?
I don't really touch on that. No, more just about the science that's been used to
Ah,
kind of figure out where they go. But that's a whole other interesting area. And like,
sure.
how do they sense magnetic fields? Like we know that they do, but we're still figuring out how and stuff like that is really interesting. Yeah. The current theory on how birds sense magnetic fields has to do with quantum physics. So it's pretty out there.
One person is asking, what role does bird banding have in migration?
That's a really good question. And the first chapter of the book is all about bird banding. So bird banding is when you put a little like metal bracelet on a bird that's got a unique number stamped onto it so that if this bird is ever recovered later, either recaptured or found dead, someone can report it. And for songbirds, the number of birds that are ever seen again, ever reported is pretty minuscule, although we have gotten some interesting, bits of data from that over the years. But early on, when we didn't really have any other way of studying bird migration, it was really important, even just those few records that came back. And the other interesting thing with bird banding is that it's typically done at what are called like bird observatories, that often they've been doing banding like in the same place every season for decades and decades and decades. And when you do that, you build up enough of a data set that it kind of stops mattering whether the birds even get recaptured, because every time they capture a bird, they're recording the date and the species and the sex and the age and the weight. And so then you have this database of like exactly the patterns of migration passing through that area every year. And so that's how we know things, for example, that like the average timing of bird migration in North America in the spring has gotten earlier by several days in the last few decades, is just from the records from these bird observatories. So there's kind of two answers to how banding contributes to this.
Rebecca,
Rebecca, oh,
go ahead, Andy.
I just wanted to mention that we've used some of this technology at our own organization. We've captured golden eagles and fitted them with transmitters, satellite transmitters,
Oh, fantastic. Yeah,
and
that's really
tracked
fun.
them. I guess it must be going back close to 10 years now, and we still have one bird that's still periodically sending data. These birds are going all the way to northern Quebec to nest, so it's quite a journey that they make. And
Yeah,
they pass right through our area very often in migration. That's why we have this hawk watch that's getting big numbers of golden eagles.
yeah, I didn't talk about him in this talk, but when I was researching the book, I managed to track down the guy who was like in charge of the project to build the very first satellite transmitters for birds, which is at some like Johns Hopkins lab or something like that. And he was a character too. Everyone that gets into this sort of thing has their quirks. So it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, good.
Rebecca, we'd like to thank you very, very much for sharing all of your work and humor, knowledge, personality. We appreciate it. You're terrific.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Much appreciated. Take care.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you.
Bye bye.